Ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to be with you, and I'm honoured to be able to deliver the 2015 Corporate Public Affairs Oration. You know, from time to time I'm asked to speak to journalism students about what it's like working in a newsroom, and I often reflect to them that despite all the planning that you might do around big news stories, big news events like an election or a budget or the Olympics, the biggest stories inevitably are those that you can't predict. Those that you didn't know were about to erupt. Now, those kinds of stories are sometimes fascinating, they're sometimes appalling, but they always get the adrenaline running in the newsroom. Now, thinking about it now, I suspect those of us who run corporate affairs, as you do, or who run a corporation, as I do, we don't hanker for those adrenaline rushes as much. But things happen. And as Harold Macmillan said when asked about the greatest challenges a leader faced, what were the greatest challenges that a leader faces in public life? Events, my dear boy, events. And so given the events of this week, including the government's announcement today of an inquiry into the events surrounding Monday's Q&A, plus the commentary and questions that have erupted around the role of the ABC, I thought it would be appropriate to address some of these issues with you tonight, and that's going to be the focus of my oration. As you know, Monday night's Q&A triggered very significant debate and controversy. A man who'd been tried and acquitted of planning a terrorist attack, who had pleaded guilty to threatening to kill ASIO officials, applied to be in the studio audience and to ask a question. It's not as though this man was unknown to the media. He'd appeared on numerous occasions previously across a number of networks. He'd been in the Q&A audience before. As someone said to me this week, free speech arguments would be easier if you were always defending Martin Luther King. At times, free speech principles means giving platforms to those with whom we fundamentally disagree. It was the crux of the Charlie Hebdo argument last year, and of course the source of the maxim that was used to describe Voltaire's beliefs. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Media organisations often give airtime to the criminal and the corrupt, to those who express views that run contrary to accepted public values. You have to set the bar very high before you begin to exclude certain views or perspectives. We still need to hear in order to gain insight into thinking, insight into motivation, to understand the root cause of behaviours and actions that we might find confronting or alarming or worse. The man who appeared on Q&A had been given considerable space by numerous media outlets in recent years. He had been paid for his media appearances by some. And if giving him space or time to express his views is an act of sedition, then the roundup of the seditious will take some time and will include, I should add, the Australian newspaper that ran an extensive article on him in 2012, charting his journey from when the terrorism charges were first laid against him. He also graced the pages of the Courier Mail. However, as we said at the ABC on Tuesday morning, other issues were triggered by giving this man a forum on live television through Q&A that were not free speech issues. I can see circumstances where a question asked by this man could have been broadcast, just as other controversial figures have asked questions on Q&A before, like Julian Assange. The risks and uncertainties of having him appear in a live programming environment weren't adequately considered, however, before the decision was made to accept his application to be in the studio audience. It's one thing to pre-record an interview and exercise editorial judgment on the content before you put it to air. But live television doesn't give you that option. And in Q&A's case, it took place with a large studio audience present. The ABC's immediate statement on Tuesday morning made this clear. These things needed to have been thought through carefully and referred up internally. We have a detailed upward referral process on matters of editorial judgment at the ABC to help guide thinking in complex and contentious matters. And we're also aware of potential security issues and are in fact continuing to talk to the AFP, as we've done in the past, to ensure that the security processes we have for the program are appropriate. Now, there are some ABC staff, past and present, who argue that to make any concession in the face of criticism is to buckle, who say it's a sign of weakness. Respectfully, I disagree. It's not weakness to say you made the wrong call. We have no problem with that. People who are equally well-meaning will often make different judgments. The judgments that count in this matter are the ones that are made by the people paid to make them. Those at the program and those in the editorial chain of command, all the way up to me and me reporting to the board. The ABC is reviewing the decision-making processes around Q&A in the light of this experience, and this is happening internally now. And the board had previously determined that Q&A would form part of this year's series of independent editorial reviews that it commissions. It will also be undertaken by someone external to the ABC, this board review, and it will look at all aspects of the program across a range of episodes, and its findings will be released later in the year. The ABC will also cooperate with the government's SNAP inquiry, which is to report back by next Tuesday. We know that live television is dangerous, that it can be unpredictable and compelling. Part of the success of Q&A is the audience knows that it's live. It's event programming. And viewing numbers increased significantly when the show commenced broadcasting live tweets on the screen. Many in the audience leaned in and got more involved. Q&A has a lot of moving parts. Pulling together the panel, bussing people in from all over the place, getting a balanced studio audience, selecting the questions and the tweets. It's hardly a straightforward proposition, and that's further fuelled by the electricity of the live production. I admire those who accept what can be the ultimate challenge of being on the panel, to test their arguments and their wit live in front of 1 million people watching. The studio crowd can be rowdy, vocal and unforgiving. And look, it's easier to find excuses not to come on the panel, but to say yes, to turn up, you need some ticker. It's a Todd Sampson-esque piece of heroics. You're on the high wire without a net. And that's not just the panel, it's the same every week for the host and the senior producers. And as we know, Q&A engages audiences and it triggers a response from them too. People will not be happy with every panel member or questioner or tweet. Not every editorial judgment made in that live program will be right. The show generates passions like few others. No other program is more heavily scrutinised by audiences and critics. I feel that Q&A has all the potential of being a 20-year-plus franchise for the ABC, so we need to treat it with care. Like Four Corners, it's a show that should endure when all current management and production teams are long gone, an enduring part of Australian public life. And those of us who have responsibility for it now are trustees for its future. Amidst this week's controversy, I don't want to lose sight of the terrific achievements of Q&A. Extraordinary programs on mental health and AIDS in the last year. That remarkable program from the Gamma Forum. Shows from Shanghai and Delhi. Those times we felt we were really having an intelligent, engaging national conversation around the things that matter. That's what Q&A can do. And while we remember these special episodes, it's also worth remembering that our highest rating Q&A episodes are often the regular ones, where politicians and community leaders thrash out the issues of the week. It's become a staple in the lives of many Australians every Monday night to tune in. We will reflect on the events of this week, have the program independently reviewed and look to ensure that it pursues and delivers its potential to be public broadcasting at its best, to inform, educate and entertain. The media firestorm that's erupted around Monday's Q&A was ferocious, but as a public broadcaster, the ABC goes through these things from time to time. At times I felt that compared to our Commonwealth broadcasting cousins in the UK and Canada, we get relatively few of these storms. But even for the ABC, things seem to have been taken to a new level, when on Wednesday we scored 4 covers in one day in the News Limited tabloids, complete with photoshopped ABC flags being waved by jihadi protesters. I have to say, not all parties to the conversation have seemed vested in pursuing a rational discourse. A question was posed this week. Whose side is the ABC on? And it's not the first time it's been asked. Menzies, Hawke, Neville Wran, they all asked it in their own inimitable ways. It's a good question. And while it's often asked with a rhetorical flourish, a question about the role and nature of the public broadcaster in these highly polarised and partisan times is a fair one. Sometimes it seems to me that questions like this are framed to cause doubt, to question what we might have felt. And while rhetorical questions are designed to be posed and not answered, I want to answer this one. It's important. Whose side is the ABC on? Well, in any team, you can be playing on the same side, but often you'll be playing in a different position, with a different role and a different responsibility. You're on the same side, but you have a different job to do in that team. You do your bit, and you work together to make the team successful. The ABC is clearly Australian. It's on the side of Australia. The A in ABC is for Australian. And the part we play, what we do for the side, is a vital one, central to our culture and our democracy, that of being an independent public broadcaster. The ABC's charter covers our responsibility to Australians who live in this country and also Australians living overseas. Our wide, diverse programming reaches Australians everywhere across the land. Inside the ABC, we talk about wanting to be the independent home of Australian conversations, culture and stories. Central to the legislation establishing the corporation is the independence of the public broadcaster. Funded by government, accountable to the public for its performance, governed by a board of eminent, independent Australians. And of course, it's precisely this independence that shapes the ABC as a public broadcaster, not a state broadcaster. A state broadcaster is the communications arm of the government. Its role is to communicate the messages of the government, and certainly not to do anything that would undermine any government message. Surely, no one seriously wants the ABC to be a state broadcaster. We know the examples: North Korea and Russia, China and Vietnam. There are many others, but that has never been the role of the public broadcaster here. We're a public broadcaster formed in the tradition set out by Lord Reith, the first head of the BBC, who spoke of a duty to inform, educate and entertain. The Reithian tradition shapes the history of the ABC, and the ABC's independence is enshrined in legislation, in the law of the land, and is entrusted to the board. The ABC Act does not envisage the ABC as another branch of government public relations. Instead, it asks the ABC to provide an independent national broadcasting service, and the board is asked to maintain its independence. The ABC's editorial policies state that the trust and respect of the community depend on the ABC's editorial independence and integrity. Independence and responsibility are inseparable. The very first editorial policy at the ABC says to maintain the independence and integrity of the ABC. There are good reasons for independence from government, just as there are good reasons, of course, for an independent judiciary. Australians cherish freedom of expression, and they cherish debate, and they cherish the role of the ABC in facilitating both. When policymakers were planning public television in Australia 60 years ago, we came up with our own model, an Australian model that offered us the best of both worlds. And when it came to the public broadcasting side, we didn't do what the British had done when they started television by making the BBC a monopoly. The ABC worked alongside private sector television organisations. We didn't do what the Americans had done, creating public television only later on, almost an afterthought in the Johnson presidency. We didn't do what Italy had done, with 3 national channels allocated to 3 leading political parties. And nor did we follow the example of the French, where the top jobs of the public broadcaster would change when the party in government changed. In Australia, when governments change, we could change the public broadcasters with them to align the public broadcaster more closely with the government's agenda, to do the government's bidding. But in order to do that, you'd have to change the ABC Act. And if you want to do that, you would destroy the ABC we have known for 8 decades. Instead, Australia has an independent ABC, and that independence is key to its credibility. It's why trust in the ABC is streets ahead of the commercial media. The Essential poll conducted earlier this week demonstrates that far more Australians put their trust in ABC TV news and current affairs than other media outlets. It's why the ABC is one of the most trusted institutions in the country, along with the High Court and the Reserve Bank. I think you'll find that in Australia, as in every country where public broadcasting exists, the most trusted public broadcasters are those that are perceived as closest to the public and the most distant from the government. That's a finding of the Neiman Journalism Lab at Harvard, noting a research paper from New York University. Now, the history of the ABC is a history that shows the anger and frustration of government at ABC broadcasts from time to time. And Ken Inglis's 2 histories of the ABC document these stoushes at length. Those of you with longer memories will recall the harsh criticism dished out by the Hawke government over the ABC's coverage of the First Gulf War. In my nearly 9 years at the ABC, we've had governments, both Labor and Liberal, and there have been stories that have generated the wrath of the government of the day. Monday's Q&A is but the most recent example. Of course there'll be stories that frustrate politicians. Of course there'll be coverage that's not of their choosing. But in my experience, most politicians have understood the importance of the independence of the public broadcaster from political pressure and interference. It's a mark of the maturity of our democracy. Most, though sometimes there'll be some who aren't reluctant to turn up the heat now and again to see what happens. Long may the independence of the ABC continue. And as it does, it is vital that the ABC appreciates that independence and responsibility are inseparable. The ABC is not perfect, and while it sets high standards, it won't always meet them. There'll be poor journalistic practice or poor editorial judgment shown occasionally, and criticism of the ABC will be well-founded. Good journalism is strengthened by setting the record straight, and that's a responsibility as well. The finest media outlets are those who, in taking accuracy and truth seriously, willingly concede error and then put things right. Now, of course, there are times when someone thinks a story is inaccurate when it's simply speaking an inconvenient truth. Other times stories will cause frustration and embarrassment to government, to business, to unions, to leading social institutions, and that's what public accountability is all about. There are stories that people would rather not have told, stories that are immediately attacked but over time are revealed to be right and of overwhelming public importance. Witness the Royal Commission into the institutional response to child sexual assault. The the ABC was at the forefront of uncovering the stories that led to the establishment of the Landmark Review. Look at Four Corners and Late Line's coverage of endemic poverty and appalling living standards in Indigenous communities. Journalism served the public interest in bringing the corruption in Queensland under Premier Bjelke-Petersen to light, in revealing the appalling treatment of customers by financial planners at the Commonwealth Bank, cruelty in the greyhound industry, the callous behaviour of James Hardie, the deception of cash for comment in commercial radio. All important ABC stories, all important stories in the public interest. And the ABC serves the public interest in this way through hundreds of stories a week, from the biggest cities to the smallest country towns. These are the contributions made by an independent public broadcaster, independent from pressure by advertisers or proprietors, independent from the need to maximise sales or advertising, independent from a government dictating the coverage it wants or needs. Independent from these pressures, but responsible under the ABC Act to deliver journalism that is accurate and impartial to the recognised standards of objective journalism. It's journalism that means speaking truth to power, pushing for disclosure and transparency, seeking to verify that we are asked to take on trust, asking difficult questions, bringing to light views that are very different to ours, being challenged and confronted to increase our understanding and insight, if not our acceptance. And the stakes don't get any higher than when you're reporting on matters of national security, not just in keeping our citizens safe, but in keeping our nation sound as well as safe, our privacy protected, our democracy robust, ensuring the integrity of our institutions, the honesty of our politicians, and that our rights as citizens are being respected. In doing this important work in our journalism, the ABC is also held to account for our decisions and our performance, and the accountability mechanisms are more robust around the ABC than any other media organisation in the country. The annual report of the ABC details the operations of the independent complaints division run by the ABC that looks into every material complaint submitted by audiences, and the ACMA can review decisions made by that complaints division. At least 3 times a year, there are public Senate hearings where, along with other ABC executives, I answer a vast number of questions for hours and hours on end, and hundreds of other questions are put on notice. There's detailed reporting on the ABC's expenditure that goes to the Federal Department of Finance, and even our own program Media Watch casts just as critical an eye over the ABC's performance as it does other media outlets, and then puts it to air for everyone to see. The ABC board is now commissioning its own independent reviews of editorial content to go alongside the extensive financial auditing process. These reviews are just part of the board's response to its editorial responsibilities under the Act. All this is unparalleled compared to any other media organisation in the country, and rightly so. We are spending taxpayers' dollars, and with the right to practice our craft comes responsibility and accountability for performance. Now, much of what I've discussed tonight goes to our journalism, a vital part of what we do, but it's only part of the role we play. And I've sometimes had to say to politicians that they do seem to get obsessed about 2% of the ABC's content. Usually that 2% that's about them or about the issues that their polling currently says is important. But the ABC is for all Australians, and it's much bigger and broader and richer than that. Political content certainly gets our attention, and the Australian public engages with Q&A and Insiders, 7:30 AM and PM. But if you look at the numbers, this is only a small fraction of the ABC's audience, the audience's ABC experiences across radio and television, online and mobile. From Play School to Charlie Pickering, from Matt and Alex to Mad as Hell, to our famous medicos, Dr Norman Swan and Dr Lucian Blake, These programs, these people represent the ABC for millions of Australians, for hours and hours and hours every week. We celebrate Australia at the ABC. We celebrate important national events and the lives of Australians, the great and the unknown. Witness our coverage on Anzac Day, dawn services around the country, marches in the capital cities, commemorations from Anzac Cove and Lone Pine. And on Australia Day, bringing the stories of the Australians of the Year and the national flag raising and citizenship ceremony. Having national conversations on absolutely crucial matters like mental health during our Mental As Week. Bringing Australians together to raise $5 million in just a few days for relief efforts in Nepal. We've been doing this kind of work for years and years. In November we commemorate 70 years of the Country Hour. Next year marks 20 years of Australian story. Since 1932 we've had local voices telling local stories to local communities on radio. As the Sydney Morning Herald noted when the ABC turned 75, you'd still have an Australia without the ABC, but it wouldn't be this Australia. This Australia owes much to the ABC, because the ABC is an indispensable part of Australian life and part of the lives of millions of Australians every day. And that's why well over 80% of Australians believe the ABC provides a valuable service. It's valuable when it discovers brilliant new Australian musical talent that will conquer the world through Triple J Unearthed. It's valuable when we listen to the beautiful work of Australian composers recorded by the ABC Classics label. It's valuable when we hear the voice of Jim Maxwell in the dead of night calling the ashes from England. It's valuable when we're listening to bird song on Macca on a Sunday morning. And it's valuable when we're absorbed by the best television drama of the year, The Secret River. And when we're absorbed by the most compelling docudrama for a decade, The Killing Season, which led to the cry during question time last week, "Thank you to the ABC." The work of the ABC, what it adds to our lives, reminds me of the words of the US physicist Robert Wilson. Wilson had been called to testify to a congressional hearing in the late 1960s, and he was being challenged by a US senator about the rationale for the government spending $250 million on a new scientific investment. And Wilson was asked whether the work had anything to do with promoting the security of the country. And Wilson said it didn't. Not at all. But then he pointed out this kind of work only has to do with the respect with which we regard one another, the dignity of man, our love of culture. It has to do with whether we are good painters, good sculptors, great poets. I mean, all the things we really venerate in our country and are patriotic about. It has nothing to do with directly defending our country, except to make it worth defending. And that is the key answer to the question about the role the ABC plays in Australia, the part we play on the team. For we are the independent home of Australian conversations and culture and stories, reaching Australians everywhere, every day, on radio and television, online and mobile. Celebrating achievement, sharing discoveries, uncovering truths, talking about the things that matter, a place where Australians can come to talk and listen, to watch and to share, helping us understand each other and understand this country better, to help make Australia, Australia. And that's how we fulfil our part on the team. Thank you very much.